we've had a long, wonderful connection with Nicholas Aieta, and I think most of you know him, but no.
I've met some of you. I haven't met everyone, but that's okay.
Anyway, but welcome aboard.
Thanks, Chips. So I was asked to come and talk a little bit about sort of the Revolutionary era. We're in the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution beginning, and in Massachusetts that means we've been doing events here going back to 2023 anyway. There weren't a lot of people who in 2015 decided to burn the governor in effigy or anything like that to celebrate the Stamp Act. But once you got to 2023 in December with the Tea Act, then things sort of kicked off. And so some of you may be familiar that Revolution 250, which is the statewide organization, has been kind of a collator of events in a variety of places across the community. Of course, for Blandford, the 2023 was an important moment because it's in that year in August, if I'm not mistaken, right? The folks from the Boston Tea Party Museum came out along with Revolution 250 representatives to provide our commemorative, hopefully still present.
We have a.
It's still in the graveyard, right?
Well, no, it's upstairs.
Oh, you put it upstairs. Okay, all right.
And we're afraid it would walk.
Yes, yes, okay.
Italian.
That's kind of what I was hinting towards, I guess. And so for Samuel Sloper, who moved here to Blandford in the 1770s, but after his participation in the Boston Tea Party, one of the things that the Tea Party Museum was doing was giving these commemorative plaques, as many of you are aware, to commemorate these folks where they were buried. And so they were traveling around to find the burial locations of the 60-ish, 65-ish or so folks who we know were involved in the Boston Tea Party. There are a lot of people who said they were there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that event, but I'll just point out that there are very few people actually we know for certain were there because most of them swore both themselves and other people to secrecy. So, you don't want to admit that you were involved in breaking and entering and, committing not necessarily any thievery, but destruction of property. In fact, these individuals were actually really careful about not taking the tea, and people who attempted to were discouraged through various means, which is a nice euphemism, I guess, for you will take that tea out of your pocket now before I do something to you. So Sloper, we'll talk a little bit about him tonight. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Massachusetts and in response to a variety of actions taken by England. And so I'll be using a couple of different things that I've got here. Heather, I know you were there. So I gave a talk in the fall of 2024 at the library in Westfield. And I don't know, was anybody at that event besides? You don't get to raise your hand for this one. And then in April, on April 9th, also at the library in Westfield. If you were there, you can just make a sign like this if I'm repeating information that you have heard or so on. But I'm doing kind of a mashup of these two things with a little bit of Blandford stuff sprinkled in, and the idea is to try to have a conversation as well and just talk with people about what's happening in these communities as the revolution starts to arrive. I'll point out just two other quick things that I'll remind folks of at the end. We will have a militia muster down at the old burying ground on Mechanic Street in Westfield on Saturday, June the 14th. The graveyard will open around 12, and the muster will not really start up until about 1 o'clock. But if you want to see folks going through drills, they're going to be using the drilling manual from the 1760s that was used by a lot of the local town militia. And we've got about 9 or 10 armed folks who are going to be there with their firelocks ready to show us how it's done. We will not get to fire anything, I want to point out, but you can watch everybody else do it. And then we have a couple of speakers who are going to be representing some of the folks who are buried in that graveyard as well. And then we're hoping that in January of 2026, we will have, as Chips was a part of in 1976, another Ticonderoga type General Knox with the oxen and the cannon and that kind of thing. For Westfield, that might amount to a cannon with some people firing it. That I don't know yet, but we have a date set aside. We have some folks from connected to the Knox train of artillery reenactors who are going to be helping us out with that. So that's just a couple of business items, just to give you some food for thought as we're talking. Chips had reminded me a couple of things, about the community that I think are important to keep in mind as we talk a little bit about what was happening in the 1770s here. In the 1760s and 70s, there's a strained relationship, right, between Great Britain and its provinces. Massachusetts had a relatively positive relationship with the Crown, and that was somewhat hardened by the way in which certain elements of conflict went in both the wars in the 1740s and then again in the 1750s and 60s. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, one of the problems that Great Britain realized is that they had expended a tremendous amount of money on these conflicts, and they began to sort of debate within Parliament itself, how are we going to deal with this issue? And what that sets off is kind of a 10-year slow walk to revolution, basically. Most of us are familiar with some of this story. We sort of center in on the fact that Americans, the provincial Americans here who were British, looked at themselves as on the east coast of what becomes the United States, looked at themselves and said, well, we're not truly represented, within Parliament. Parliament's viewpoint was, well, you are represented, you're just represented by other people speaking for you. And even, great personages such as Benjamin Franklin looked at this and said, well, we are British, that's what we are, that's what we want to be. And by the time he's living in London in this time period, Franklin's getting up in years, he's already about 60, but he's going to live until 1796. So he's one of these great people that we can look at as somebody who illustrates almost the entirety of the 18th century. Born in 1706 in Boston, and then dies in 1796. And he is most famous for his time in Pennsylvania, but his connection with New England is something that he made great use of in his publishing career, for example. So when he's in London, one of the things that Franklin is asked all the time is, well, what are the British Americans thinking about, in the aftermath of this French and Indian War? And for Franklin, for the first part of the time he's there, like the first half or so, first 2/3 of the time that he's there, he's determined that, well, we just want to be heard, but we still want to be part of the British Empire. But in the last third or so of the time that he's present, representing the interests of Pennsylvanians, he's not a voting member, certainly, but he has audiences with people in Parliament and so on. He is beginning to see that there's a change afoot. His son is going to be the Royal Governor of New Jersey and will remain a loyalist. That's how divisions kind of broke in the aftermath here, right, as we move forward in the war years. But for Franklin, he's going to see that the people he represents, the fellow Pennsylvanians, they're going in a different direction. And he sees his home province, in this case Massachusetts, also going in a different direction by the time he leaves England. So, but we're still not at revolution, right? And so, like, one of the things that is really, I think, hard for us to grasp sometimes is that revolution wasn't one event happens and then we're off. Even what happens at Lexington and Concord in 1775 is not necessarily the final straw for leading to revolution. It seems like it on paper. I mean, there's people who die, British soldiers are shot, British Americans are shooting at British soldiers. This seems like it's a done deal, but it actually takes even more action. And in point of fact, even the violence at Charlestown in June of 1775 doesn't quite push everybody in Massachusetts full bore into revolution. So why not? Well, that's harder to discern. Professor Joanne Freeman, who teaches at Yale, looks at it like elastic. It's kind of the elasticity of rebellion, and we know when elastic gets a little old, it gets sort of brittle, and eventually it'll snap. My grandfather had a habit of wrapping tons of things in elastic, and as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, when I would find these things, they'd been wrapped in elastic for 30 years in some cases, and those things would snap, like right in my face, which wasn't always pleasant. But the point was that it had reached its time, basically. It couldn't hold any longer. For the British Americans, they could hold a lot longer than we might have thought. And so what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about some of the events that lead us into trouble. But a couple of things that we want to point out is that, in Blandford, again, even as their neighbors and neighboring communities around are troubled by actions taken in the Parliament or by the military governor of Massachusetts, Blandford is not necessarily sending representatives to speak in the provincial Congress, and yet neighboring communities are, and it's not I would argue it's probably not a disinterest. It's just sort of we're trying to live our lives. We're not trying to actually participate in this, and that goes to this issue of, well, when is the revolution a revolution? So I'm going to use a couple of different examples here. So one of the things that happens in the aftermath of the Stamp Act in the 1760s, there are people in eastern Massachusetts, certainly, and also in Worcester County, who rise up in criticizing British government agents and suggesting that we don't want this tax collected. You see that in Berkshire County as well, and even in Westfield. And so I had one example of a description of a decision reached in Westfield that I wanted to just share with the group. But it wasn't true up here. And so very close by, down the hill, the Westfield residents asked for an avoidance of any fines that were imposed on them if they didn't pay this particular tax. And then sent a document to the governor at the time in the 1760s here. So they said, we viewed and considered ourselves, meaning Westfield residents, as well as many of our fellow subjects, to be aggrieved. And in this situation, we imagine that the actions being taken are an invasion of liberty, and concluding that in point of fact, the government had no fact, right, or authority by law to execute such writs and processes as we conceived by the Act of British Parliament. And this document went on to suggest that they would block any attempts to arrest anybody from the community, for debt or for non-payment. These individuals were represented by Joseph Hawley, and Hawley was at the time a member of the General Court, but also a justice, and essentially issued a writ of pardon in 1765, or 66 rather, for any actions taken by people in 65 and 66. But as you had pointed out when we have been talking about this talk, that is not something that is happening here. We don't have the community here taking that kind of action, even preemptively, as they do in Westfield. The other thing to know about the Stamp Act is that it really doesn't really impact the British Americans as much as they might have thought it would have, because people in Parliament disagree with it. So the act is passed, it's put in place, and we have to think about communication, right? How long it takes to get information across the Atlantic Ocean and so forth. And folks are just not they're not interested in creating that kind of conflict. And then it's important to remember as well that there were allies of British Americans, within Parliament who spoke favorably about what British Americans had done in the last war, so the war with the French, what British Americans expected for their subjecthood, basically. And it's another important reminder, we're subjects at the time, right? Subject of the crown, we're not citizens, and we are subject to. So the crown was seen as something that was supposed to, protect us to a degree, and yet communities like Blandford or in other places in Massachusetts were in some cases filled with individuals descended from folks who came here because they didn't feel particularly kindly towards the crown. And so that was kind of an interesting stretch again on that elasticity of the relationship. The other thing that I would point out is that smaller communities like Blandford was, which has perhaps just under 800 people or so living in it on the eve of the Revolution, are again very much concerned with themselves, right, and what's going on. And if we look at the language and discussions of what's happening in Blandford at the time, there's a lot of concern about who's leading the church, who's going, the First Congregational Church in particular, which is periodically, as some of you may be very familiar, led by individuals who are simply paid to come in, but then they're not really particularly liked. The congregation had a great deal of power, right, over the pastors, so they would essentially vote people out. And this was a pretty unstable time for the community, and that was something they were more concerned with than what was happening in Boston, let alone what's happening in England. And yet, by the time of the Lexington Alarm, communities had begun to take certain kinds of action. So Westfield, unlike Blandford, had sent people to go speak and listen at the provincial congresses that were held in September and October of 1774. And Westfield tended to send the same people again and again. Their town meeting would select folks, often who were already leaders within the town meeting, and then send them with, in many cases, up through February anyway of 1775, very specific instructions. Just listen. That was essentially it. Don't do anything. We don't want you voting in favor of something that's going to insult the king. We don't want you voting in favor of something that could potentially create conflict. And yet conflict was already happening, right? So there's an example, I already talked about it, but the year before, in 1773, we've got the attack on the private property at the tea ships. In 1774, in December, we have a lot of tension throughout the New England provinces, and particularly in a lot of rumors flying about. So one of the things that becomes very concerning to people is the actions that might be taken, not that they were going to be taken, but that might be taken by British military officials in neighboring New Hampshire in December of 1774. And at that point, a variety of communities, Blandford certainly among them, but other, would have small regular gatherings, in some cases of individuals who had been veterans of the French and Indian War, in other cases with younger men, and they would do their monthly training exercises. Depending where you were in New England at the time, those training exercises were taken with a little more care than at other times. And in the case of one of the challenges down the hill in Westfield was that not everybody who was doing training actually had a weapon. So you might walk through some of the exercises, but you don't actually have a firearm, in which case, what are you actually training for? I mean, they're training for the inevitability of maybe being able to pick up a weapon, on a battlefield. But there's a lot of camaraderie more so than anything else going on. In the case of this incident that happens in New Hampshire in December of 1774, the rumor comes out that the individuals are going to, the British military is going to lock down the Powder House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And this was something that in many cases communities had a powder house that they ran themselves, and in other cases it was run by a division of the British military. In the case of Portsmouth, the powder house was run by a very small contingent of individuals, mostly invalided soldiers, numbering approximately 6. And they were not, I just want to point out, locking the gates and shutting down the powder house and none of that stuff. But suddenly, they found themselves in December of 1774 facing a large group of alarmed colonial British Americans who had been training and so on, and who ultimately decided that they needed to actually secure said powder. And for whatever reason, and we don't know exactly why, those 6 or so British soldiers decided that they would resist, which they did briefly, and then were overrun because their numbers were quite small compared to that of the British Americans. And yet, still, again, we don't end in warfare. We could have. Maybe, right? And yet we don't quite end there. And there's another incident I'll just briefly describe as well that kind of leads to this. What else is happening? The other thing that's happening in places like Blandford are folks are aware that the governor role in Massachusetts has been transformed. There's now a military governor for the province. That alarms people. They do feel as though there are some liberties being taken away slowly, very slowly, over time. General Gage is trying to figure out exactly how to maneuver the relationship he has with a variety of communities. In the fall of 1774, he does suggest that it's okay for the towns to meet. Again, Blandford doesn't send a representative, but the other towns that do start talking about, well, what if scenarios. And Gage quickly realizes that maybe actually having everybody get together and talk with each other is a bad idea. And so, but it's a little too late because he starts to then sort of say, well, maybe you don't get to meet as a provincial legislature. Well, now you've taken a bad idea and you've doubled, by allowing them to meet, and doubled down on it and made them more annoyed by saying, well, actually you can't. So the Massachusetts residents start to begin to become very suspicious of what it is that the governor is going to be allowing or not allowing. And that's kind of where things sit in this moment when this situation happens in New Hampshire. Gage is aware that people are trained in this community, but he doesn't necessarily believe that they will actually resist the British military. And one of the things that happens here is when Captain Ferguson gathers the 30-odd Blandford residents to go out after, towards the end of April, early May in 1775, after word has arrived of what's happened in Lexington and Concord, people aren't sure exactly what's going to happen. We tend to think of, and maybe it's because our state, university, the nickname is the Minutemen, right? We tend to think of that everybody was a Minuteman. That's actually kind of a misnomer because each town might have militia, but each town did not have Minutemen. There was a very specific difference between these, which is a minor trivial point in some respects, but did mean that not every community had Minutemen, although every community had militia, if that makes sense. The Minutemen actually literally were almost like an offshoot of the militia who had a very specific training regimen that was quite different from just everyday militia work. And so when individuals came, as Ferguson and his comrades did from Blandford, or someone like Tim Bigelow out of Worcester County, and heading towards Boston in 1775. Nobody was exactly certain what was going to happen, right? There's stories, the news reaches here very quickly. The arrival of news to the Springfield area is by April 20th, so the violence occurs on April 19th. The word arrives here by April 20th, and then it's filtering up into the hill towns, right, in the days and weeks afterwards, but also into Connecticut, right, parts of New Hampshire, Vermont, etc. And different places. Of course, Vermont wasn't Vermont yet, but that's a whole other story that we won't get into. They do become an independent republic in 1777 and run their own country from 1777 until 1791. Some would argue they still run their own country, but that's a whole other conversation. So one of the things that that's happening is this uncertainty again. Okay, I'm going to march to Boston, and I'm marching from Blandford, or I'm marching from Northampton, or I'm coming from Westfield or Palmer or wherever. What now? What are we expecting? Well, we've heard all kinds of, we've heard the story, all right, the British military have fired upon Americans. We've also heard all kinds of rumors by that point, by the time you get to April 20th, 21st, 22nd, and so on. And what the Americans aren't certain of is, well, how is the Crown going to respond? Because we knew that people in Parliament believed that the British Americans had certain rights as subjects that were being trampled on. And so there are people who speak up in Parliament repeatedly. This is not the right action. Do not use military action. Do not inhibit their political meetings and so on. You will only create more tension and get that rubber band, too taut, right? So it's going to snap. So one individual like that was someone like Edmund Burke, who pointed out that Americans love their liberties. Why? Because they're descendants of us, right? Here in England, and we love liberty, so why wouldn't they love liberty? And he speaks in great defense of these individuals. And he said, if we give 2 million people some share of those rights, but then take them away, the colonies need to have the idea of their civil rights associated with their government. They will cling and grapple to you, meaning to England. So this is Representative Burke's words here. And no force under heaven will be of power to tear them from their allegiance. But if that cohesion is loosened, everything hastens to decay. So to the colonies then, in a sense, and you can hear to Burke as well, that rebellion would be drastic. And this is early 1775 that he's saying this. So before word gets back to England about what's happened, in Lexington and Concord. I'll just tell a couple of other stories, then I want to talk a little bit about some people, and then we'll have some questions, conversation, etc. But so in February of 1775, and I'll apologize because Heather, you've heard this story, but one other, almost violence occurs in Salem. And so we've had the assault in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where the colonists have gained control of their powder in Portsmouth. And Gage doesn't take action against the colonists. Sort of says, well, okay, I can understand. He roots out down to the rumors, understands what was going on. Let's not compound the problem by taking action. But Gage was of a mind to believe that a big show of force would get the British Americans to stop any of this nonsense, basically. So he ordered a contingent to march to Salem, and in Salem they would do what the rumors about what was going to happen in New Hampshire, which were rumors, they weren't actual, it wasn't an actual closing of the powder mill. But for Salem, that's exactly what Gage intended, was to go and take the stores, get them, and be done with it. And so he gave orders to a particular unit. British Americans sat on this sort of edge of warfare and conflict and hostility. Gage is aware that not only are representatives attempting to meet within Massachusetts, but they're also meeting in Philadelphia to talk about what to do with the relationship with Great Britain. And he is determined to offer some level of intimidation to a degree by taking these stores from Salem. So the unit sets out. It's February, and this is about the same time that down the hill in Westfield, the town committee has decided maybe we should actually get ready in case something happens. And they take an inventory of the weapons they have, and they don't have many. What they find is they've got about 30, 35 firearms, they've got a few bayonets, but they have about 50 men who in theory are in the militia. So they're sort of wondering how to balance that out. So at that same moment, Gage is moving these troops, and what we have is a witness here, William Gavitt, who described the event this way. And I'm going to point out a couple of things. This story is a little bit suspect because William Gavitt and another woman who was interviewed talking about this described this event not in 1775, but rather when they were interviewed in the 1820s. So you can just think a little bit about some of the problems there, looking at an event backwards some 35 plus years, and trying to figure out what's reality and what isn't. So William Gavitt described it this way. He said that it was a Sunday, first of all, and that one we can affirm. It was indeed a Sunday. February 26th, 1775. My father came home from church rather sooner than usual, which attracted my notice. Which, every time I read this, I always think, I'm noticing you weren't at church, which is an interesting bit in, not unusual at this era, just as an aside, where there is a generational divide on that issue, but still the son not at church. But neither was mother, which attracted my notice. I said to mother, father said to mother, the regulars are come and are marching as fast as they can towards the bridge. And he looked towards her with a solemn face and remarked, I don't know what will be the consequence. Keep the children in. I looked out the window just at this time and saw troops passing by the house. So it's a Sunday, the fathers come in, he's disturbed by the movement of the troops. Note that they're referred to as the regulars. That's an appropriate designation for them. Remember, we're all British, right? So it's not the British are coming, because that would mean we're arriving, you know. It's regulars, meaning regular troops, not militia. And the militia leader, David Mason, received tidings of the approach and ran into the church during service, crying out, the regulars are coming after the guns. At this point, several men ran out of the church, so now they're leaving church. They're going to move the guns, and my father looked in and to see if he could recognize any of the soldiers, many of whom were known to him. And at this point, I want to remark that the soldiers that were stationed in Massachusetts, particularly in the eastern part of the state, we didn't have them out here. We didn't have regular militia units, or even just south of us in Hartford. These soldiers were known to people because in many cases they'd been living in Massachusetts since 1773, or for over a year in some cases, and in a few instances, it's a much smaller number, for longer than that period of time. And but there was a larger unit that had come here via Nova Scotia, so that the men were moving from Ireland to Nova Scotia to Boston, and then in kind of a rotation. One of those groups having been involved in the Boston Massacre in March of 1770, and that group, as you can imagine, was rotated out, but they did bring others in to the space. So his father's pointing out he might recognize some of these soldiers because these soldiers worked multiple jobs. They were soldiers, of course, but they also had other occupations because they needed money. Many of them were married, in some cases to people from the local community, and in other cases to people they had brought with them from Ireland or England. And at any rate, so his father seemed to be, well, if there's someone I know, then maybe I could ask them, well, what's going on? Like, what are you doing? Why are you even here? And he could discover, he said, no familiar faces, and was blackguarded, meaning insulted, by the soldiers for his inquisitiveness, who asked him, what was he looking after? At this point, what the commander of this small British contingent sees is now a resistance. They see a small group of militia. They also have a problem. There's a drawbridge in front of them. So they get across one bridge, but then there's a drawbridge, and the militia draw up the drawbridge. And they say, well, you're not passing by on this particular piece. And the British commander says, well, you have to lower the bridge or we'll fire. And the militia leader, Mason, says, well, if you fire, you're all going to be dead. Supposedly. Again, this is the witness talking about this years later, so, and then supposedly, one of the things Gavitt finds out later is that the militia leader's plan was that if the British started firing, he would run in front of the British soldiers and then throw himself in the river and drown himself. I'm not sure why that would solve anything other than, in his mind, according to Gavitt, Mason's concern was, well, if I did have to actually do violence against the British regular, if I were dead, then I could not be punished after the fact, apparently, was his logic. So anyway, the eyewitnesses noticed, there's multiple eyewitnesses, right? So it's Gavitt and some other folks, but noticed that it was very cold. It's February 26th. It wasn't apparently, according to the witnesses, one of those warmer New England February days, but rather a colder one, and the troops were not wearing everything. They had marched, they didn't have their greatcoats on, they didn't have all their equipment with them, and so the longer they stood at this drawbridge, the colder they got. And they were at attention and waiting for orders, and according to the witnesses, beginning to shiver and coughing and other things. And so meanwhile, they started taunting them. And so they called them all kinds of things, including cowards, lobster coats, of course, and then cried, "Damnation upon your government," which was a risky thing to say. And everybody, at that moment, this is like that moment when you're in a crowd and everybody's shouting insulting things, and then one person goes a step too far. The crowd of militia turned on that one individual and said, "You can't say that." Which is interesting again, because where's our rubber band? It's not quite there yet, right? Even though we know in a couple of months people are going to be shooting at each other. So they said, well, you can't say that because it's one thing to mumble and complain, but if you say something of that nature, then it could lead to us being fired upon, and we don't want that. The British commander insisted that it was the King's Highway. I have the right to go on here. And an old gentleman, Gavitt points out that Mr. James Barr, who was an Englishman, said it's not the King's Highway, it was built by the owners of the lots on the other side. No king or country or town has anything to do with this highway at all. And that guy was born in England and now lives here in America. So that was an interesting kind of moment where he has a very clear sense of what his rights are in the context of this road. Most of us probably are aware. I mean, when we drive in certain places, I went to high school on Cape Cod, and so near my high school is the King's Highway, and the King's Highway is Route 6A, basically. It was also called the Queen's Highway at one point because Queen Anne was alive, and then when she was replaced by King George, it became the King's Highway, and so on down the line. And by the time we got to the next female monarch in England, we were the United States, so we didn't call it the King's Highway anymore. Except we do, interestingly, so some of those names stick around, regardless. But in this case, Barr is complaining about it, and then the British commander's kind of stuck here. He's like, well, so he makes a proposal, and he says to the militia commander, if I can just walk across the drawbridge, and I can march my men 50 feet over the drawbridge and then turn around and march back to Boston, then I will have done what I was told to do, because he he's saying, he's arguing, he was told to march into the town, look, and come back. And they argue about this for a little while. But ultimately, the militia commander allows it. And they do exactly that. They march across, he looks, about face, they walk back, and they leave. But 2 months later, they don't leave, right? Because 2 months later, less than 2 months later, they march to the common, somebody fires, we don't know who, and the firing commences. And then at the next bridge, which is the town over in Concord, the firing commences even more. And yet still, as I said at the outset here, we're not fully at war, really. We are, but we're not. And that's something that is important to keep in mind. So like when Ferguson marches off from Blandford, he's doing so because, well, Boston has been under siege. The immediate response in the aftermath of what happens at Concord and Lexington is that approximately 15 to 20,000 New Englanders descend on the city of Boston from the outside. They can't get in because the British have it bottled in. And we don't always think about this, but for those of you familiar with the city, you know that where the Red Sox play, for example, which is Fenway Park, is part of this place called the Fens. Well, that was all underwater until the 1830s. And the Charles River was a much bigger estuary than it is now. And so the city itself was actually pretty easy to defend from a military perspective but it was also equally a trap because you couldn't get in or out very easily. So also Boston had a fair number of loyalists inside of the community. So for the army to retreat into the city wasn't a big problem. But when people like Ferguson and others march out, they arrive at a city and there's sort of this aimlessness for a little while. Like, well, what do we do? Well, what are we supposed to do? Well, we're not supposed to let the British out. Okay. But there isn't really a lot of open combat until you get to June of 1775. And as far as we know, Ferguson and the 30-odd folks from Blandford are not involved in that. And that's true of your neighbors down the hill in Westfield as well. They're not directly involved in what happens in Charlestown. But eventually, the Continental Congress sends an individual to take control of the situation, to try to sort out how we're going to eliminate the British threat here. And yet still, by the end of the summer of 1775, the British Americans are not necessarily saying, we want open war. And indeed, there are administrations and notes back and forth across the Atlantic to try to get people not to go to war. And yet, we do. I thought I'd just close with one example of an individual here. So this is James Stewart, who some of you may know something about. So Stewart was born here in 1749. He's one of the 30 who joined John Ferguson, and so when he's heading down to Lexington in the Boston area, he's just coming up on 26. He's not quite 26 yet. He'll be 26 that fall, and he marched with the company, and then what happens with the Blandford folks is they're generally, if you look at their service, they're connected to Timothy Danielson's group. So he's a Hampshire County commander, but he's from east of here. And we're not yet Hampden, we're still Hampshire County at the time. And so most of the Hampshire units end up in some way, shape, or form under Timothy Danielson. And Stewart performed a variety of garrison duties in the time between May, June 1775 and beyond. He was, when he signed up, he agreed to stay for 9 months. So the idea was he would stay basically to February or so. Some of you are probably aware that March is the evacuation day moment for for Boston, so it's March 17th, which later in history becomes a convenient double holiday for Bostonians. For a long time, it was a state holiday, only celebrated in Boston. We didn't get to really celebrate it out here, but as a state employee, occasionally we get weird days off. Like we used to get Bunker Hill Day off when I first started working at Westfield State, but we don't anymore. The individual, Stewart is here. He reportedly agreed to stay in service for an additional month, which means he stayed through the evacuation moment in March. And this information I'm just sharing with you is from a descendant of Stewart's, who is a member of Sons of the American Revolution. Stewart eventually will he'll move from here. He'll be buried in New York, and that was not uncommon in the aftermath of the war. Stewart returned home here to Blandford in the spring of 1776, but then enlisted again in December of 1776, and was mostly like a quartermaster type. He was bringing goods and services back and forth between certain places, serving in Connecticut as well as Massachusetts, and moving items between December 1776 and the spring of 1777. He also then, in the spring and summer of 1777, was back and forth into what becomes Vermont. And so he's connected to moving supplies up and down the western part of Massachusetts in this contested area that New Hampshire liked to claim, New York liked to claim, Massachusetts liked to claim, and of course Vermonters said, it's Vermont. So that's what, and he was in the Bennington area for part of that. And then eventually he was involved in working at Ticonderoga in the months leading up to its evacuation. So British Americans had taken control of Fort Ticonderoga. That's where we get the cannon to go march across Massachusetts to bring to the evacuation. But by 1777, we're actually losing control of Ticonderoga again. We said we give the fort up. He's there just before that. And then in the aftermath of the Saratoga campaign, he is involved in moving prisoners around in a variety of locations between basically September, October into November of 1777 before he is dismissed from service and returns back here to Blandford once again. Eventually he moves to New York, as I mentioned before, where he's buried. He, and just to give you a sense of longevity here, right, so again, he's born in 1749. Why do we know any of this? Because he gave testimony to his experiences in 1832. A lot of Revolutionary veterans, as they were getting quite old in the 20s and 30s, are beginning to give testimony in order to be able to receive pensions. Which, interestingly, totally different topic, but I'll just make the remark, Congress didn't want to give them. There was, in fact, quite a contentious series of arguments about whether veterans of the American Revolution should have been given pensions at all. So, there's a long legacy of, we need your service. We don't actually want to reward you for your service. So thank you. And that is, that's a legacy that really hasn't changed much since the arguments in the late 18th and early 19th century. But that's why he gave that testimony, to account for his pieces. And you see this all over the place in the region. So whether it's towns like Blandford, or there's a gentleman who was from Connecticut but who enlisted in Westfield, when he's giving his, when his great niece is giving her testimony in the late 1820s up in Barre, Massachusetts, she's doing this because she is, and witnesses testify to her being, the only living descendant of this particular person. And that person had been granted a land deed up in Maine, in a remote space of Maine, that nobody else seemed to want, and she wanted. And so she had to get all these witnesses together to assure everybody, A, that her great uncle was dead, B, that he was who he said he was, C, that the paperwork she had, which indicated the land had been signed over to her, provided he did not have descendants, was legitimate. All this while being only partially literate, which is just another interesting story in her case, because she's really much dependent on her neighbors, to help do some of the work for her. And so veterans and their descendants were faced with all kinds of challenges in the aftermath of the conflict. Sorry, that story just popped into my head, so I thought I'd throw that one in there. But I have talked way longer than I intended to, so I apologize. I'm not going to have necessarily tons of answers to questions that people might have, but if you've got general thoughts, questions, remarks, reactions, anything of that nature, please feel free to throw them out, and I will lean or sit for this one. Go ahead.
Poor old Sloper. Sloper was really quite a
Oh,
character.
Sam, yeah.
His time here, he supposedly was a bit of a raucous character of sorts, somewhat crude, but also loved by everybody. He ended up on practically any time there was a major disturbance in the revolution, he went off, left his tavern and went off to fight, leaving a bunch of militia people, like 5 or 6 different times in the course of his life. And in 1802, things were getting pretty thin around for a lot of people in the area here in terms of making a living, and quite a few people were looking west, and he was part of the crew that was buying into a new operation out in Ohio.
Right.
Had bought the land and set to go, and unfortunately he died.
Yes.
Before he managed to take off, but his whole family left, and he had a young daughter who died here, and so his grave has both his young daughter and himself, but the rest of the family were happily set out in this western part of out in Ohio.
And there's a great resource here if you're interested in Sloper, just to get a sense of the kinds of things he did, because he ran a tavern, but he also had this other business, and so his account books are here, and you can kind of flip through those and see all kinds of interesting things. And account books are tricky to use sometimes, but what you find when you're looking at them is you learn a lot about the neighbors, almost as much as you do about the person who's running the business, because you figure out who's paying in syrup, and who's paying in rum, and who's paying in, which he did not mind. Mm-hmm. As you and I have talked about, he certainly did not mind getting paid in a variety of alcoholic things, because then he could sell that. But it's also interesting to see, what were people buying? Who was buying shoes? Why were they buying shoes? What kind? What other leather work, was he doing, that kind of stuff?
We have a number of account books that are fascinating.
Right.
But Sloper's are at UMass, I believe.
Did you move them there? Because I looked at them like 3 years ago.
Where? Here?
Yeah.
The Sloper's one?
Yeah. I have pictures on it.
Oh, maybe.
So maybe we moved some of them. I mean, but it's a lot of people like Ashley's books, from Sheffield. They're all up at UMass.
Right.
Anybody who has kind of a larger footprint, if you will, in the state, they tend to move things out.
But
that one,
bartering was a big
part of
life.
Absolutely.
Big time.
Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah, sure.
We have probably my 10th great grandfather was Jedidiah Smith.
Oh, yes.
Oh, so you know the story.
Well,
No, go,
You tell the
tell it.
story, because we
I
were
can't-
talking about it.
A
But
lot of
I was
people
trying
don't
to
know.
find it on my phone and I can't, so I don't have dates, but he was a pastor in Granville and he was a loyalist and his congregation threw him out.
right.
And so he and all of his eldest son, Jedidiah Jr., went to Wethersfield, Connecticut and got on a boat. And apparently there were some British officers as well, and they were going down, I believe, to Mississippi, to where they were forming a colony for loyalists. And sadly, he got sick while he was on the boat, and they got outside of, I don't remember the port city, but they weren't allowed off the boat because smallpox was going around, and he ended up jumping into the Mississippi River and drowning, and he was buried in Natchez. But his son Jedidiah Jr. became a very well-known lawyer and resident here in Blandford.
Quite a character.
Yeah, but it also goes to show the family divisiveness,
Right.
like with Ben Franklin and his son and,
Right.
and Jedidiah.
Yeah, the towns were not. It wasn't as if you'd have a loyalist town and then the next one over would be a patriot town, or the mixing between the moderates, the loyalists, and the patriots, so called, were really close. In some cases, obviously within families. Smith also serves in the Revolution, the younger, obviously, and that colony idea gets repeated in a couple of places. The Florida territory, which was technically Spanish, is one space. As you mentioned, the Mississippi area, which technically, according to Europeans anyway, was at the time kind of Spanish. The Spanish having been given some of this control of this space in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, but really was largely Choctaw still, and so that space isn't really open in some respects. But there are groups that start to go out of these other colonies because they are afraid of what the relationship's going to be like. So like Thomas Brown, for example, in Georgia, he was what you would have called a neutral, but in just sort of said, look, I'm just going to live my life. I don't really want to get involved here, and the local community was leaning more strongly patriot. They came to ask for aid and so on from Brown, and he refused, and ultimately they ended up attacking him in a variety of different ways, tarring and feathering him. They fractured his skull, broke his ankle, among other things. And so they turned unintentionally, they didn't know this obviously at the time, but they turned a neutral into an ardent loyalist, who then led a really pretty powerful and violent loyalist insurrectionist group, basically against patriots throughout Georgia, but centered in Florida because they could escape, right? So, out of colonial Georgia into Florida, and then they would ride out. And I've remembered something. It's not his thing. You're right, Chips. It's Sloper is in the account books that I was looking at. Buying stuff and making these trades.
I think his
and that kind
actual
of thing.
account books
But
are
yeah.
at UMass.
Yeah.
But someday I'd like to go look at them, whether they have little added. Some of the account books that we have here of various people have little drawings and little, kids have gotten in and done little interesting things. They're pretty fascinating. Gene York and Mary Powers, some of you know, both of these people are no longer with us, but they spent many hours with a tape recorder going over account books, and they could, with each entry, they would make little comments about what was going on here, and it's a very amusing kind of deal. We have these are all on tapes that somehow we've got to save in terms of their commentary.
Is it like reel-to-reel tape?
These are.
Is it reel-to-reel tape?
No, these are cassettes.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting challenge, because one of the problems we run into, even in the I'm in my 18th year at Westfield State, and you know, the equipment I could use at the beginning versus what I have access to now,
Right.
even in that short period of time, is very different.
And got to digitize everything.
Right, and so just something as simple as, hey, I have a file that I'm working from, and it's, you know, it's on a 3.5 by 5, you know, floppy disk or whatever, right? Well,
Right.
forget that. Like the information technology people don't even have. They used to have a device. They would keep it for a certain amount of time, and you could always sort of backtrack, you know, like. But that's why I asked if it was real, because one of the problems we've had is we do have some, in our archives, we have some interviews and that kind of stuff, and the problem is, well, what do you do with it?
Right.
And even digital doesn't last forever, so that's another challenge that you have to kind of think about. Transcribing and putting in paper is actually...
The human race is probably not going to last forever either.
Well,
so.
so we should start typing now, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or questions, comments? Great.
We have just one last
Oh, yeah.
footnote here.
Oh,
We've got 57 of the burials across the street were actually given credit for having participated in the Revolution. And some of them a little bit, we had one incident back in it was, I think, 78, I don't know what the date was, but there was some rumor that things were going sour in Northampton, and that the boys in Boston felt that we needed to send them a militia group over to straighten things out. And so it was there were a group of like 12 or 15 people from Blandford who did I think it was a 4-day expedition to put down these people, and it was a wonderful party all the way over there and back again, and the town gave them enough oats to feed their horses for the 3 days that they were out here. But that counted as being a member of the Revolution.
Right, and that's true. It's a good example actually, because so James Stewart, who I used as my kind of end cap there, Stewart's in and out of the service, but he's not always in combat, and that's something that we don't always think about, right? That there's a lot of work to do besides, even if sometimes it's a boondoggle up to Northampton to make sure that people aren't being too loyalist up there. But the area, especially after Saratoga, the region starts to see a lessening of that. There's still muster requirements, so every town had to send a certain number of people, and it's interesting to see what some towns did to acquire that. So for example, Palmer, Massachusetts will to fulfill their muster, they actually bought enslaved people to put them into service, which is a whole other sort of problem, and that's an appropriate whistle. But you mentioned 57 are buried over here, and just roughly 300 of Blandford's residents in the 1770s were men, and the majority of them, if they were able-bodied, would have been at least
We
trained
have other cemeteries in town, and we
Right.
also have burials that were in the backyard, and
Right.
people,
Right.
those who died were not brought back necessarily. We have a wonderful version of Soldiers and Sailors. I don't know if you've undoubtedly seen our
Yeah.
little. This is a set of books that most cities and towns have to go through a great many volumes or whatever. But we had let's see whether it said who did it, but the compiled by Sumner Gilbert Woods, the guy who
That makes
wrote
sense.
there are 3 big books or whatever, but extracted all the material about how people from Blandford were involved with the Revolution, and it goes into what battles they were at and whatever, and it's really quite a wonderful tool that we have at our.
And it is
Our
nice to
total.
have it pulled out because you can get the big volume sets, and if you know the names you're looking for, of course, you can look them up. But as you might imagine, some people have the same last name and the same first name. And then hopefully they're not in the same county, and oh dear, they are. Okay, now what? You know, and so you have to kind of like sort through that to really get it. But that makes sense that it
But it's
would
really
do
a
that.
wonderful tool for anybody who's interested in the history of revolution in Blandford.
I know that Chips has water and apple cider back
We
there.
do, yeah, anybody.
I assume this is not
A little refreshing.
hard cider,
No,
which was
it's
a big
not.
deal in Blandford
No,
in the 1790s.
but we do have, we have a still on the stairway up here.
Right.
It's not active at the moment.
Not active at the
But
moment.
it was, you know, in the good old days, the 6 or 7 taverns in town
Right.
were well occupied with,
You can't drink the water, it's not clean enough. So, you know.
so,
Anyway, well, thank you again. I will return the high chair, which has